10 men of God who use sacred trust to commit the most heinous crimes imaginable, from child sexual abuse to murder-for-hire plots to terrorist conspiracies that shocked America and exposed the darkest corruption hiding behind religious authority. These weren't ordinary criminals operating in shadows. They were spiritual leaders who exploited their divine authority to prey on the most vulnerable members of society: children seeking guidance, widows needing comfort, and faithful congregation members who trusted them with their lives, their money, and their souls. Over 400 years in combined prison sentences, millions of dollars stolen from believers, and countless lives destroyed by men who claimed to speak for God while committing crimes that would make hardened criminals recoil in disgust. From televangelists running elaborate Ponzi schemes that bankrupted entire ministries, to rabbis hiring professional hitmen to murder their wives, these cases represent the ultimate betrayal of everything sacred in human society. Welcome to Savage Case Files. Today, we're exposing 10 religious leaders whose crimes shocked America and shattered faith in spiritual authority, revealing how men who preached about salvation and redemption became predators who destroyed the very people they swore to protect and serve. Unlike ordinary criminals who operate outside society's trust structures, these men weaponized sacred trust and divine authority to access victims and commit unspeakable acts that ordinary criminals could never accomplish. They used prayer meetings to drug and rape women, summer camps to abuse children, and religious counseling sessions to identify and exploit their next victims. We'll take you inside the most devastating religious betrayals in American history, from cult leaders who married children as young as 8 years old, to televangelists who defrauded widows of their life savings while preaching about God's financial blessings. You'll witness how federal investigators exposed terrorist conspiracies planned in mosques, child trafficking operations disguised as religious communities, and murder plots hatched by respected spiritual leaders. These cases span decades of American religious life, showing how sacred authority became the perfect weapon for criminal exploitation. Each man understood that religious trust creates unique access to victims who would never suspect their spiritual leaders of harboring criminal intentions, making churches, temples, and religious communities hunting grounds for predators wearing clerical collars. From wire fraud to terrorism, from child rape to contract murder, these religious criminals proved that no crime was too heinous when committed by someone claiming divine authority and sacred purpose. Subscribe to Savage Case Files to never miss our investigations into betrayals by those society trusts most, where we expose the criminals hiding behind badges, pulpits, and positions of power, revealing how authority becomes the perfect weapon against the innocent. Case 1. Jim Whittington. Jim Whittington was a charismatic televangelist who built his ministry empire on promises of financial blessings and divine prosperity, attracting wealthy donors through his magnetic personality and prosperity gospel message that convinced believers God wanted them to be rich. Operating from his television studio, Whittington preached that faithful donations to his ministry would result in miraculous financial returns blessed directly by God Himself. Whittington had perfected the art of targeting vulnerable believers, particularly elderly widows who were grieving the loss of their spouses and desperately seeking both spiritual comfort and financial security. His prosperity teachings promised that generous donations to his ministry would unlock God's financial blessings, creating a deadly combination of spiritual manipulation and financial fraud that would destroy lives. The crime that would ultimately destroy Whittington's ministry involved an elaborate conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable widow of over $900,000 through mail fraud and money laundering schemes disguised as religious investment opportunities. He convinced the elderly woman that God had revealed special investment opportunities exclusively to his ministry, requiring her to transfer her life savings to access these divine financial blessings. Whittington exploited the widow's faith and loneliness following her husband's death, using religious authority to gain complete access to her financial accounts and personal trust. He presented fake investment documents blessed by his ministry and claimed that her deceased husband was communicating through him, urging her to donate everything to secure her eternal financial security. The federal investigation revealed an elaborate scheme involving multiple bank accounts, fake religious investment certificates, and money laundering operations designed to hide the stolen funds from authorities. While preaching about God's financial blessings on television, Whittington was systematically stealing a widow's entire fortune through religious fraud that violated both federal mail fraud and money laundering statutes. Federal prosecutors uncovered evidence showing Whittington had used the stolen money to fund his lavish lifestyle, including expensive cars, luxury homes, and personal expenses that contradicted his ministry's supposed charitable mission. The investigation revealed that virtually none of the widow's money had been used for legitimate religious purposes, exposing the entire operation as criminal fraud disguised as ministry work. The legal proceedings resulted in Whittington's conviction on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, mail fraud, and money laundering, with prosecutors demonstrating how he had systematically exploited religious trust to commit financial crimes. The court found that his use of religious authority to access and defraud the vulnerable widow represented a particularly egregious form of criminal exploitation. Whittington was sentenced to 26 months in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victim, though the financial and emotional damage to the widow could never be fully repaired. The case demonstrated how prosperity gospel teachings could be weaponized to exploit vulnerable believers, particularly elderly individuals, seeking both spiritual comfort and financial security. The impact of Whittington's crimes extended beyond his immediate victim, as the case became a template for federal prosecutors pursuing religious financial fraud cases and exposed how televangelism could be used as a cover for systematic criminal exploitation of faithful believers. Case 2. Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker was a televangelist and TV host who built the PTL Praise the Lord ministry into one of America's largest religious media empires, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Christian broadcasting through his daily television programs that reached millions of viewers worldwide. Starting with his wife, Tammy Faye, Bakker had transformed from small-town preacher into a media mogul who controlled a vast network of television stations, theme parks, and religious property. Bakker had developed an elaborate fundraising system that promised donors lifetime partnerships in his PTL ministry, offering exclusive access to vacation accommodations at his Heritage USA Christian Resort and theme park in South Carolina. These partnerships were marketed as both spiritual investments and vacation opportunities, with Bakker claiming that supporters would receive eternal rewards for their financial contributions to God's work. The criminal scheme that would destroy Bakker's empire involved selling far more lifetime partnerships than his facilities could possibly accommodate, creating a massive, Ponzi-like fraud that defrauded followers of millions of dollars. Bakker sold over 150,000 partnerships for accommodations that could only house a fraction of that number, knowing that the promises he was making were mathematically impossible to fulfill. The financial fraud became even more complex when Bakker used ministry funds to pay $265,000 in hush money to former church secretary Jessica Hahn, attempting to cover up a sexual encounter that threatened to destroy his ministry's reputation. This payment came directly from donations that followers believed were supporting Christian television programming and charitable work, representing a direct theft of ministry funds for personal purposes. Federal investigators discovered that Bakker had been systematically diverting ministry donations to fund his lavish lifestyle, including expensive homes, luxury cars, and personal expenses that had nothing to do with religious work. Behind the cameras and Christian programming, Bakker was running a massive financial fraud that treated donor contributions as his personal bank account. The investigation revealed that PTL's financial records were deliberately falsified to hide the extent of the fraud, with Bakker and his associates creating fake accounting documents to conceal how ministry funds were being diverted for personal use. The scheme had grown so large that the ministry was essentially bankrupt, while Bakker continued soliciting donations from unsuspecting viewers. Federal prosecutors charged Bakker with 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy, demonstrating how he had systematically deceived his television audience about how their donations were being used. The trial revealed the shocking extent of financial mismanagement and deliberate fraud that had characterized PTL's operations for years. Bakker was originally sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, though this was later reduced to 8 years, and he ultimately served approximately 5 years before being released on parole in 1994. The sentence reflected the massive scale of his fraud and the betrayal of trust that had characterized his criminal exploitation of religious donors. The PTL scandal destroyed one of America's largest televangelism empires and exposed widespread corruption in religious broadcasting, leading to increased scrutiny of ministry finances and fundraising practices. The case became a watershed moment that forever changed how Americans viewed televangelist fundraising and religious media operation. Bakker's fall from grace demonstrated how religious authority could be exploited to facilitate massive financial fraud, showing that even the most prominent Christian leaders were capable of systematic criminal behavior when motivated by greed and personal ambition. Case 3. Tony Alamo. Tony Alamo was an evangelist and cult leader who founded the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, attracting followers through apocalyptic teachings and claims of divine authority that positioned him as God's chosen messenger for the end times. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman, Alamo had transformed himself into a charismatic preacher who combined Christian fundamentalism with bizarre conspiracy theories and claims of supernatural powers that mesmerized vulnerable believers seeking spiritual guidance. Alamo had built his ministry around absolute control over his followers' lives, creating isolated compounds where he exercised complete authority over every aspect of their existence, from their daily schedules to their personal relationships. He taught that he was the only true prophet of God, and that questioning his authority was equivalent to rejecting God himself, creating a psychological environment where followers feared eternal damnation for disobeying his commands. The horrific crimes that would ultimately destroy Alamo's ministry involved the systematic sexual abuse of children, including marrying girls as young as 8 years old in ceremonies that he claimed were blessed by God. Alamo convinced his followers that these marriages were divinely ordained and that he had the right to multiple wives of any age, using religious authority to justify the most heinous forms of child sexual abuse. Alamo's criminal operation included transporting underage girls across state lines for sexual purposes, creating a federal case that would expose the full extent of his systematic abuse of children within his religious community. He moved young victims between different ministry locations to avoid detection by local authorities and to ensure continued access to his preferred victims. The cult leader had created an environment where parents willingly surrendered their children to his authority, believing that Alamo's claimed divine status gave him the right to determine their daughters' futures. While preaching about moral purity and Christian values, Alamo was sexually abusing children in God's name, using religious ceremonies to legitimize criminal acts that violated both state and federal laws. Federal agents launched a comprehensive investigation that uncovered decades of systematic child sexual abuse and trafficking within Alamo's ministry, revealing a criminal enterprise that had operated under the protection of religious authority for years. The investigation involved multiple states and federal agencies working together to document the full scope of Alamo's crimes against children. The federal prosecution resulted in Alamo's conviction on charges of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his systematic abuse of children within his religious community. The trial revealed the shocking extent of his criminal behavior and the psychological manipulation he had used to silence his victims. Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, one of the most severe sentences ever imposed on a religious leader for sexual crimes against children. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the number of victims who had suffered under his authority, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to abuse children. Alamo died while serving his sentence in 2017, finally ending a criminal career that had destroyed countless young lives through the systematic abuse of religious authority. His case exposed how cult leaders could use religious isolation and divine claims to facilitate the most heinous crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. The Tony Alamo case became one of the most notorious examples of religious authority being used to facilitate systematic child abuse, demonstrating how spiritual manipulation could create environments where the most vulnerable victims had no protection from predatory leaders claiming divine authority. Case 4. Dwight York. Dwight York was a cult leader who founded the Nubian Nation, mixing religious teachings with bizarre pseudoscientific claims that he was an extraterrestrial being from another planet with divine authority over his earthly followers. Born Dwight David York, he had reinvented himself multiple times throughout his criminal career, adopting various personas and religious identities while consistently using his charismatic leadership to exploit vulnerable people seeking spiritual meaning. York had developed an elaborate mythology that combined elements of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and science fiction, claiming to be an alien from the planet Reek who had come to Earth to prepare humanity for an approaching apocalypse. His followers believed he possessed supernatural powers and divine knowledge that made him the ultimate spiritual authority, creating a psychological environment where questioning his commands was considered both blasphemous and dangerous. The Nubian Nation compound in Putnam County, Georgia, became the center of York's criminal empire, where he systematically abused children of his followers while claiming that his actions were part of divine rituals necessary for their spiritual development. York convinced parents that surrendering their children to his authority was essential for their salvation, using religious manipulation to gain access to dozens of young victims. York's crimes included child sexual abuse, rape, racketeering, conspiracy, and tax fraud, representing a comprehensive criminal enterprise that operated under the protection of religious authority for over a decade. He had created an isolated community where his word was absolute law and where children had no protection from his predatory behavior, as their own parents believed his abuse was divinely sanctioned. The investigation revealed that York had been systematically abusing children for years, using his claimed extraterrestrial status and divine authority to justify criminal acts that violated both state and federal laws. Federal agents discovered evidence of widespread abuse involving dozens of victims, with York using religious ceremonies and private counseling sessions to access and abuse children within his community. York's criminal operation extended beyond sexual abuse to include financial crimes, as he used his religious authority to avoid paying taxes and to defraud government agencies through false claims about his organization's charitable status. The racketeering charges reflected the systematic nature of his criminal enterprise, which combined child abuse with financial fraud under the cover of religious activity. Federal and state prosecutors worked together to build comprehensive cases against York, with federal authorities pursuing racketeering charges, while state prosecutors focused on child molestation counts. The dual prosecution strategy ensured that York would face severe consequences regardless of the outcome of either individual case. York was convicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to 135 years in federal prison, while also facing state convictions for child molestation that added additional decades to his sentence. He is currently serving his sentence in ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America. The Dwight York case represents one of the most severe cult abuse cases in American history, demonstrating how religious authority combined with isolation could create environments where systematic child abuse flourished without detection. His case exposed the vulnerability of children in closed religious communities, where parental authority was surrendered to charismatic leaders claiming divine status. York's 135-year sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the number of victims who suffered under his authority, ensuring that one of America's most dangerous religious predators would never again have access to potential victims. Case 5. Terry Hornbuckle. Terry Hornbuckle was a pastor of a Dallas-area church who had built his reputation as a respected community leader and spiritual counselor, gaining the complete trust of congregation members who sought his guidance during their most vulnerable moments. Hornbuckle had positioned himself as a compassionate minister who specialized in helping women through personal crises, using his pastoral authority to gain intimate access to their lives and deepest struggles. Hornbuckle had developed a pattern of targeting women in his congregation who were experiencing emotional distress, marital problems, or personal trauma, offering private counseling sessions that he claimed would provide spiritual healing and divine guidance. His victims trusted him completely, believing that his pastoral authority and claimed connection to God made him a safe person to confide in about their most personal struggles and fears. The horrific crimes that would destroy Hornbuckle's ministry involved drugging and sexually assaulting multiple women from his congregation during what they believed were legitimate counseling sessions. Hornbuckle used his position as their spiritual advisor to convince victims to meet him privately, where he would drug their drinks and then sexually assault them while they were incapacitated and unable to resist or remember the attacks clearly. Hornbuckle's criminal method involved using drugs to incapacitate his victims before sexually assaulting them, ensuring that they would have limited memory of the attacks and would be less likely to report the crimes or provide clear testimony against him. He exploited the trust that pastoral counseling relationships created, knowing that his victims would never suspect their spiritual leader of harboring criminal intentions. The investigation began when multiple women from Hornbuckle's congregation came forward with similar stories of feeling drugged and disoriented after private counseling sessions with their pastor. Police discovered a pattern of sexual assault that had been occurring for years, with Hornbuckle using his pastoral authority to silence victims who feared that reporting their pastor would destroy their faith community. While offering spiritual counseling and promising divine healing, Hornbuckle was systematically drugging and raping the women who trusted him with their deepest vulnerabilities and spiritual needs. The investigation revealed that he had been exploiting pastoral counseling relationships to identify and access victims who were already emotionally vulnerable and unlikely to be believed if they reported sexual assault by their respected pastor. The criminal investigation uncovered evidence of drug-facilitated sexual assault involving multiple congregation members, with forensic evidence supporting the victims' accounts of being drugged during counseling sessions. Police found that Hornbuckle had been using prescription medications to incapacitate his victims, demonstrating premeditation and systematic criminal behavior. Hornbuckle was convicted on multiple charges of sexual assault and drug-facilitated rape, with the court finding that his use of pastoral authority to access and assault victims represented a particularly egregious form of criminal exploitation. The prosecution demonstrated how he had systematically violated the sacred trust that pastoral counseling relationships required. Hornbuckle was sentenced to 15 years in prison and was later committed to a psychiatric institution after completing his criminal sentence, reflecting both the severity of his crimes and concerns about his continued danger to potential victims. The case exposed how pastoral authority could be weaponized to facilitate systematic sexual assault against vulnerable congregation members. The impact of Hornbuckle's crimes extended beyond his immediate victims to destroy the faith community he had led, as congregation members struggled to understand how their trusted spiritual leader had been systematically abusing the women who sought his guidance and counseling. Case 6. Rabbi Fred Newlander. Rabbi Fred Newlander was a Reform rabbi who had led Congregation Umkor Shalom in Cherry Hill, New Jersey for over 2 decades. building a reputation as a respected religious leader and devoted family man who counseled countless couples about marriage and spiritual commitment. Newlander had become a pillar of the Jewish community, trusted by hundreds of families who sought his guidance on matters of faith, relationships, and moral decision-making. Newlander had maintained the appearance of a perfect religious leader with a stable marriage to his wife Carol, who worked as a baker and was beloved by the congregation for her warmth and community involvement. Behind this facade of religious devotion and marital commitment, however, Newlander was conducting a secret romantic affair with Elaine Sonsini, a Philadelphia radio personality who had become obsessed with having an exclusive relationship with the married rabbi. The crime that would destroy Newlander's life and reputation involved hiring professional hitmen to murder his wife Carol so he could pursue his extramarital relationship without the complications of divorce or scandal that would destroy his religious career. Newlander had become convinced that eliminating his wife was the only way to maintain both his affair and his position as a respected religious leader in the community. Newlander's murder plot involved contacting criminal associates who could arrange a contract killing that would appear to be a random home invasion, allowing him to maintain his innocence while benefiting from his wife's death. He provided the hitmen with detailed information about his wife's schedule and home security, ensuring they would have easy access to their target when she was most vulnerable. On November 1, 1994, two men broke into the Newlander home and brutally murdered Carol Newlander, beating her to death in what initially appeared to be a botched robbery. While counseling families about marriage and commitment, Newlander had been plotting his wife's murder to eliminate the obstacle preventing his complete relationship with his mistress. The investigation initially focused on random crime theories, but police gradually uncovered evidence linking Newlander to the murder through his connections to the hired killers. Detectives discovered that the rabbi had been having an affair and had financial motives for wanting his wife dead, including life insurance policies that would benefit him significantly. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators connected Newlander to Len Genoff and Paul Daniels, two men with criminal backgrounds who had carried out the contract killing on his behalf. The investigation revealed that Newlander had used his position in the community to identify and contact individuals willing to commit murder for money. The legal proceedings stretched over several years, with Newlander's first trial ending in a hung jury before prosecutors successfully convicted him in a second trial. The evidence demonstrated that he had systematically planned his wife's murder while maintaining his role as a spiritual counselor and community leader. Newlander was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison for orchestrating his wife's murder, with the court finding that his use of religious authority to maintain his facade while planning the killing represented a particularly heinous form of criminal deception. The case shocked the Jewish community and demonstrated how religious leadership could not prevent prosecution for violent crime. The Rabbi Newlander case became one of the most notorious examples of a religious leader committing murder, showing how the appearance of spiritual devotion could mask the most violent criminal intentions and how sacred trust could be exploited to facilitate the ultimate betrayal. Case 7. Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman was an Islamist leader known as the Blind Sheikh, who preached at mosques in the New York area, using his religious authority and scholarly reputation to attract followers through radical interpretations of Islamic law that justified violence against American targets. Born in Egypt and blinded in childhood, Abdel Rahman had become an influential religious scholar whose fatwas and teachings carried enormous weight among extremist Muslims seeking religious justification for terrorist activities. Abdel Rahman had established himself as a spiritual leader for radical Islamic groups operating in the United States, providing religious guidance and theological justification for violent attacks against American civilians and government targets. His followers viewed him as a legitimate Islamic scholar whose religious rulings made terrorism not just permissible but religiously mandatory for faithful Muslims. The crimes that would ultimately destroy Abdel Rahman's terrorist network involved masterminding the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and planning additional large-scale terrorist attacks against New York landmarks and political figures. He had used his religious authority to organize and inspire a terrorist cell that viewed mass murder as a religious duty commanded by God through his teachings. Abdelrahman's terrorist conspiracy extended far beyond the World Trade Center bombing to include plans for simultaneous attacks on the United Nations building, the FBI headquarters in New York, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, and the George Washington Bridge. His followers also planned to assassinate prominent political figures, including Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and various American officials. The investigation revealed that Abdelrahman had been operating an extensive terrorist network under the cover of religious preaching, using mosques and Islamic centers as meeting places where his followers planned mass murder in the name of religious warfare. While preaching about faith and Islamic law, the blind sheikh was planning terrorist attacks that would kill thousands of innocent Americans. FBI surveillance uncovered the full scope of Abdelrahman's terrorist conspiracy, including recorded conversations where he provided religious justification for bombing civilian targets and murdering government officials. The investigation demonstrated how he had used his religious authority to transform ordinary Muslims into willing terrorists who believed they were serving God by committing mass murder. The federal prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that Abdelrahman had been the spiritual leader and primary organizer of a terrorist conspiracy that threatened American national security. Prosecutors showed how his religious teachings had directly inspired and justified the World Trade Center bombing and numerous other planned attacks. Abdelrahman was convicted on seditious conspiracy charges for his role in planning and inspiring terrorist attacks against American targets, with the court finding that his use of religious authority to organize terrorism represented a fundamental threat to national security. The conviction demonstrated that religious freedom could not protect those who used spiritual authority to plan mass murder. Abdelrahman was sentenced to life in federal prison, where he remained until his death in 2017, ensuring that one of America's most dangerous religious terrorists could never again use his spiritual authority to inspire violence against innocent civilians. His case became a landmark prosecution that established legal precedents for pursuing religious leaders who used their authority to organize terrorism. The blind sheikh case demonstrated how religious authority could be weaponized to justify and organize terrorism, showing that spiritual leadership could become a tool for mass murder when combined with extremist ideology and hatred for American society and values. Case 8. Lawrence Hecker. Lawrence Hecker was a Catholic priest who served in the New Orleans Archdiocese for decades, gaining the trust of countless families who believed his religious vows and sacred authority made him a safe person to guide their children's spiritual development. Hecker had built his reputation as a dedicated parish priest who worked closely with young people, using his position to gain intimate access to children and teenagers through religious education programs and private counseling sessions. Hecker had exploited his role as a trusted spiritual advisor to systematically abuse children throughout his career, targeting vulnerable teenagers who sought his guidance and viewed him as a representative of God's authority on earth. His victims trusted him completely, believing that his priestly status and religious vows guaranteed their safety when they were alone with him for spiritual counseling or religious instruction. The crime that would finally expose Hecker's decades of abuse involved the rape of a teenage high school student in the 1970s, an attack that represented just one incident in a pattern of systematic sexual abuse that had been covered up by church hierarchy for decades. Hecker had used his position as a parish priest to access and abuse numerous young victims, while the archdiocese protected him from legal consequences. The institutional cover-up that protected Hecker involved New Orleans Archdiocese officials who knew about his abuse, but chose to move him between different parishes rather than report his crimes to law enforcement authorities. Church leaders prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over the safety of children, allowing Hecker to continue abusing new victims in each parish where he was reassigned. For decades, Hecker's victims suffered in silence while the church hierarchy protected their abuser and prevented justice from being served, demonstrating how religious institutions could become criminal enterprises that facilitated ongoing abuse. The archdiocese's systematic cover-up allowed Hecker to abuse children for years while maintaining his position as a respected religious leader. The delayed justice in Hecker's case came only when his victims found the courage to come forward decades later, supported by changing social attitudes about clerical abuse and legal reforms that extended statutes of limitations for childhood sexual abuse cases. Investigators finally uncovered evidence of the systematic cover-up that had protected Hecker throughout his criminal career. The criminal prosecution revealed the shocking extent of institutional protection that had allowed Hecker to abuse children with impunity, as church documents showed that archdiocese officials had known about his crimes but had chosen to protect the abuser rather than his victims. The case exposed how religious authority could be used to silence victims and prevent criminal accountability. Hecker was finally prosecuted and convicted on sexual abuse charges in his 90s, receiving a life sentence that ensured he would die in prison for crimes committed decades earlier. The conviction represented a victory for his victims, who had waited decades for justice while their abuser lived freely under church protection. Hecker died while incarcerated, finally ending a criminal career that had been protected by religious institutions for decades, while his victims struggled with the trauma of abuse that had been systematically covered up by church hierarchy. His death in prison provided some measure of justice for victims who had been denied legal recourse for most of their lives. The Lawrence Hecker case became a symbol of the broader Catholic Church abuse scandal, demonstrating how religious institutions had systematically protected predator priests while abandoning the children they were supposed to protect and guide toward spiritual growth and moral development. Case 9. Lamore Miller Whitehead. Lamore Miller Whitehead was a self-proclaimed bishop who led Leaders of Tomorrow International Ministries in Brooklyn, flaunting his wealth on social media while claiming divine connections to New York City's political elite and promising his congregation that faithful donations would unlock God's financial blessings. Miller Whitehead had built his reputation on flashy displays of luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and designer clothing that he claimed were evidence of God's favor and proof of his spiritual authority. Miller Whitehead had developed an elaborate persona that combined prosperity gospel preaching with claims of intimate relationships with powerful political figures, particularly New York City Mayor Eric Adams, whom he falsely claimed as a close personal friend and political ally. His congregation believed these fabricated connections gave him special access to city resources and political influence that could benefit their community. The crimes that would destroy Miller Whitehead's ministry involved wire fraud, attempted extortion, and making false statements to federal authorities about his political connections and financial activities. His most devastating crime involved stealing money from a parishioner's elderly mother's retirement savings, convincing the family that their donation would help him purchase a home that would benefit the entire congregation. Miller Whitehead had convinced Pauline Anderson, an elderly parishioner, to give him $90,000 from her retirement savings by claiming he needed the money to purchase a home that would serve the congregation's needs. Instead of using the money for its promised purpose, Miller Whitehead spent the elderly woman's life savings on luxury personal items and lifestyle expenses that had nothing to do with ministry work. The financial fraud extended to Miller Whitehead's attempts to extort a businessman for $5,000 by falsely claiming he could use his political connections to help resolve the man's legal problems with city authorities. He demanded payment for services he could not provide, using his fabricated political relationships to convince victims that he possessed influence he had never actually earned. While preaching prosperity gospel and promising divine financial blessings, Miller Whitehead was systematically stealing from his own congregation members and lying about his connections to political figures to gain credibility and access to potential victims. His social media presence showcased luxury items purchased with stolen money, while his victims struggled with financial hardship caused by his fraud. The federal investigation revealed that Miller Whitehead had been making false statements about his relationship with Mayor Adams and other political figures, using these fabricated connections to convince victims that he possessed special influence and access to city resources. The investigation showed that his claimed political relationships were entirely fictional. Federal prosecutors charged Miller Whitehead with wire fraud, attempted extortion, and making false statements, demonstrating how he had systematically deceived his congregation and the broader community about his financial activities and political connections. The prosecution revealed the extent of his exploitation of vulnerable believers who trusted his claimed divine authority. Miller Whitehead was convicted on all federal charges and sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, with the court ordering him to pay full restitution to his victims, including the elderly parishioner whose retirement savings he had stolen. The sentence reflected both the severity of his financial crimes and his exploitation of religious trust to facilitate fraud. The case exposed how modern religious fraudsters could use social media and fabricated political connections to enhance their credibility and access victims, demonstrating that traditional religious fraud had adapted to contemporary technology and political culture, while maintaining the same fundamental pattern of exploiting faith for personal profit. Case 10. Maury Davis. Maury Davis was a violent criminal who murdered Sunday school teacher Judy Kazako in Nashville, Tennessee, in 1975, shooting her to death during a robbery that shocked the local community and demonstrated his complete disregard for human life and religious values. Davis had been living a life of crime and violence when he committed the murder that would define his criminal legacy and raise profound questions about redemption and accountability. Davis had targeted Kazako during a robbery attempt, killing the innocent Sunday school teacher who had dedicated her life to serving her church community and teaching children about faith and moral values. The brutal murder represented the ultimate violation of everything sacred, as Davis destroyed a life devoted to religious service and community support through his selfish criminal actions. The investigation and prosecution of Davis's murder case resulted in his conviction for manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, leading to a sentence that many believed was inadequate given the severity of his crime against an innocent religious educator. Davis was sentenced to serve time in Tennessee's prison system, where he would claim to experience a religious transformation that changed his entire worldview. During his incarceration, Davis claimed to have undergone a profound religious conversion that transformed him from a violent criminal into a born-again Christian who had found salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. He participated in prison ministry programs and claimed that God had forgiven his sins and called him to serve others through religious work and community outreach. Davis served 8.5 years in prison before being released on parole, having convinced prison officials and parole boards that his religious conversion was genuine and that he no longer posed a threat to public safety. His claimed transformation from killer to believer became the foundation for his eventual return to society and his controversial entry into religious ministry. After his release from prison, Davis eventually became an evangelical pastor, founding Cornerstone Church in Madison, Tennessee, where he preached about redemption, forgiveness, and second chances to congregations who knew about his criminal past. His transformation from convicted killer to religious leader sparked intense debate about whether violent criminals should be allowed to assume positions of spiritual authority. The controversy surrounding Davis's ministry centered on whether someone who had taken an innocent life could legitimately claim divine authority and spiritual leadership over others, particularly given that his victim had been a dedicated Sunday school teacher whose life was devoted to religious service. Critics argued that his criminal past disqualified him from religious leadership, regardless of his claimed conversion. Davis's supporters argued that his story demonstrated the power of religious redemption and that his personal experience with crime and incarceration gave him unique insights that could help others avoid similar mistakes. They viewed his transformation as proof that even the most violent criminals could find salvation and contribute positively to society through religious work. The case raised fundamental questions about the nature of redemption, accountability, and religious authority, as communities struggled to determine whether violent criminals who claimed religious conversion should be trusted with spiritual leadership roles. Davis's story became a test case for beliefs about forgiveness, second chances, and the possibility of genuine transformation. The Maury Davis case represents the complex intersection of criminal justice, religious redemption, and community safety, demonstrating how violent crimes against religious figures can create lasting controversies about accountability, forgiveness, and the appropriate limits of religious authority in American society. Across decades of American religious life, these 10 cases reveal disturbing patterns that expose how sacred authority becomes the perfect weapon for criminal exploitation, with each case demonstrating the systematic targeting of society's most vulnerable populations through the abuse of spiritual trust and divine claims. The victim demographics remain consistently predictable: children seeking spiritual guidance, elderly believers needing comfort, widows facing financial insecurity, and faithful congregation members who viewed their religious leaders as representatives of God's authority on earth. These criminals understood that religious communities created unique access to victims who would never suspect their spiritual advisors of harboring criminal intentions. Financial exploitation appears in nearly every case, from Jim Whittington's $900,000 widow fraud to Jim Bakker's PTL Ponzi scheme that bankrupted thousands of believers who trusted their donations were supporting God's work. Religious authority provided the perfect cover for financial crimes, as victims believed their contributions were investments in eternal salvation rather than funding criminal lifestyles. Sexual abuse cases demonstrate how religious authority created unprecedented access to victims, with predators like Tony Alamo, Dwight York, Terry Hornbuckle, and Lawrence Hecker using spiritual counseling, religious ceremonies, and pastoral authority to access and abuse their targets. The sacred trust inherent in religious relationships made victims less likely to report abuse and more likely to blame themselves for their victimization. Institutional protection emerges as a critical factor enabling these crimes, particularly in cases like Lawrence Hecker, where the Catholic Church systematically covered up abuse for decades. Religious organizations often prioritized protecting their reputations over victim safety, creating environments where criminal behavior flourished under institutional protection. Psychological manipulation techniques show remarkable consistency across all cases, with each criminal using religious authority to silence victims, prevent reporting, and maintain control over their communities. The threat of eternal damnation or spiritual consequences proved more effective than physical intimidation in controlling victims and witnesses. Legal challenges consistently emerged around prosecuting religious figures, as defense attorneys exploited religious freedom protections and community support to shield their clients from accountability. However, cases like Sheikh Omar Abdelrahman's terrorism conviction and Tony Alamo's 175-year sentence demonstrate that religious authority cannot ultimately protect criminals from federal prosecution. The escalation patterns reveal how religious criminals often progressed from financial fraud to more serious crimes. Sentencing disparities reflect the court's recognition that religious authority represents an aggravating factor in criminal cases, with judges imposing severe sentences that reflected the betrayal of sacred trust. The combined sentences exceed 400 years, demonstrating judicial recognition that these crimes represented fundamental violations of society's most sacred institutions. The historical consistency of these patterns proves that religious authority will always attract criminals seeking to exploit society's most vulnerable populations, requiring constant vigilance from law enforcement and communities to protect potential victims from predators wearing clerical collars. 10 men of God who proved that sacred trust could become the deadliest weapon against the innocent, from televangelists who stole widows' life savings, to cult leaders who abused children in God's name, to rabbis who hired hitmen to eliminate inconvenient wives. These weren't ordinary criminals operating in society's shadows. They were spiritual leaders who weaponized divine authority to commit crimes that would make hardened felons recoil in disgust. The victim toll speaks volumes about the devastating power of religious betrayal. Hundreds of children sexually abused by men claiming divine authority. Millions of dollars stolen from believers who trusted their spiritual leaders with their life savings, and countless lives destroyed by predators who used prayer meetings, counseling sessions, and religious ceremonies as hunting grounds for their next victims. Over 400 years in combined federal prison sentences demonstrate that American courts recognize religious authority as an aggravating factor that makes these crimes particularly heinous. From Tony Alamo's 175-year sentence for child abuse to Dwight York's 135 years for racketeering and sexual assault, these cases show that claiming divine authority cannot shield criminals from the consequences of their actions. The financial devastation extends far beyond individual victims to entire religious communities that were destroyed by their leaders' criminal behavior. These cases expose the fundamental vulnerability that religious faith creates in human psychology: the willingness to trust completely, sacrifice everything, and surrender critical thinking when someone claims to speak for God. Each criminal understood that religious authority provided unprecedented access to victims who would never suspect their spiritual advisors of criminal intentions. The patterns remain consistent across decades: financial fraud disguised as ministry work, sexual abuse justified through religious authority, and institutional cover-ups that protected predators while abandoning their victims. Whether through medieval violence or modern media manipulation, the techniques of religious exploitation adapt to each era while maintaining the same core strategy of transforming sacred trust into criminal opportunity. From wire fraud to terrorism, from child rape to contract murder, these religious criminals proved that no crime was too heinous when committed by someone wearing a clerical collar and claiming divine mandate for their actions. Which case shocked you most? The blind sheik who planned terrorist attacks while preaching about faith? Or the flashy Brooklyn bishop who stole an elderly woman's retirement savings while flaunting luxury cars on social media? The Catholic priest whose abuse was covered up for decades? Or the cult leader who married children as young as 8 years old? Subscribe to Savage Case Files for more investigations into betrayals by those society trusts most, where we expose the criminals hiding behind badges, pulpits, and positions of power, revealing how authority becomes the perfect weapon against the innocent. 10 men who proved that the greatest evil often wears the mask of righteousness. This has been Savage Case Files, where sacred trust becomes criminal betrayal.